glad she prayed. I'm so glad she prayed for me.
Somebody take over.
You're doing fine. Keep on.
Okay.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon.
Somebody prayed for us.
Can y'all hear me? Okay. Welcome to those of you in the singing audience here at the Aquinas Center at Candler School of Theology at Emory University for the 2025 National Catholic Conference on Restorative Justice. My name is Chrisanne Valancourt Murphy, and I serve as Executive Director of Catholic Mobilizing Network, the national organization working to end the death penalty, advance justice solutions to crime and incarceration that uphold human dignity, and begin healing through restorative practices and approaches. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to those of us joining by online today, by live stream. Nearly 1,300 people have registered for today's live stream conversation. The dialogue is part of the Jubilee Years Inspired gathering called Tangible Signs of Hope, where we aim to illuminate concrete examples of how Catholics and people of goodwill can contribute to restorative justice efforts to transform the U.S. system of capital punishment and incarceration. As he opened the Jubilee year 2025, the late Pope Francis called for Catholics to be, in his words, tangible signs of hope for those of our brothers and sisters who experience hardships of any kind. He reminded us, this is an ancient appeal, drawn from the Word of God. It calls for acts of clemency and liberation that enable new beginnings. In this holy year, we are invited to be agents of reconciliation, bearing witness to a love that transforms and elevates even in the darkest moments. This dialogue is the result of a special collaboration between Catholic Mobilizing Network and the Initiative for Catholic Social Thought in Public Life at Georgetown University. Kimberly Mazik, Associate Director of the initiative, will moderate this panel. Kimberly has served in key positions at Catholic Relief Services, Catholic Charities USA, and the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, East-West Province. She's joined by an incredible array of panelists. Elizabeth Brunig is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She was previously an opinion writer for the New York Times and the Washington Post, where she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Featured Writing. Travis Claybrooks is the founder and CEO of Rafa Institute, which improves community safety by helping the marginalized communities access essential resources like housing, healthcare, education, and economic support. Sister Donna Layed is a precious blood sister. She's a trained restorative justice practitioner and coordinated the women's programs at Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation in Chicago. And Justice Harold Melton, who served for 16 years as a justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia and resigned as Chief Justice in 2021, following his appointment in 2018. Last night, we were joined by Archbishop Hartmeyer of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Atlanta. He presided over our Mass. I'd like to share a powerful and fitting quote from his homily for our audience related to our conference theme and our conversation today. Archbishop Hartmeyer said, "When we speak of tangible signs of hope, we are speaking of very practical, lived realities. Like a victim of violence who finds her voice and experiences healing through restorative encounter. Like an incarcerated man who discovers that he is more than his worst mistake and begins to walk a new path. Like a community that chooses dialogue over vengeance and reconciliation over division. And like a church that embodies Christ's mercy by standing with the marginalized and insisting that no one is disposable. Every person is made in the image and likeness of God. Hope becomes tangible when it is seen, touched, and lived in these ways. We are thrilled that this panel, entitled When Justice and Mercy Meet, Restorative Justice, Racial Equity, and the Work of Reconciliation, will continue to add important insights to our shared conversation. Please join me in welcoming this esteemed panel and this important dialogue.
Thank you, Chris-Ann, and thanks all of you who are here in the room, but also all of you who are joining us online this afternoon. We can't think of a better time to have this conversation. When I was thinking about the theme and what we were asked and invited to think about, I just reminded ourselves that Catholic social teaching calls us to stand in solidarity with the poor and vulnerable, advance justice and the common good, and protect human life and dignity. All of those principles to me are evident in restorative justice, an approach to achieving justice that involves, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense or harm to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. Chris-Ann mentioned the late Pope Francis. I still am inspired by his writing and his work. And in Fratelli Tutti, he invited us to build a culture of encounter and dialogue. And in Fratelli Tutti, he wrote, approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know and understand one another, and to find common ground. All these things are summed up in one word, dialogue. If we want to encounter and help one another, we have to dialogue. There is no need for me to stress, and this is Pope Francis, the benefits of dialogue. I have to only think of what our world would be like without the patient dialogue of the very generous persons who keep families and communities together. Unlike disagreement and conflict, persistent and courageous dialogue does not make headlines, but quietly helps the world live much better than we imagine. Just last week at the Jubilee for Workers of Justice, Pope Leo reflected on justice and its functions in society and invited participants there in Rome to always express to the fullest the exercise of justice and the service of people with eyes fixed on God. He also said, while justice disposes us to respect the rights of each person and promote the harmony that preserves the common good, he reminded us that the gospel speaks of a higher justice that makes mercy the key of interpretation in relationships, moving one to forgiveness. This power of forgiveness does not turn away from human justice, but questions and reshapes it, challenging it always to go further because it impels one towards reconciliation. So those are my short reflections as we move into this conversation. But today we're going to look at, these tangible sides of hope as we offer a window into the ways that restorative justice makes the gospel come alive, while also often addressing some of the most challenging situations in our homes and in our communities. So once again, thanks to all of us who are on the live stream. Thanks for your patience. I know we started a little bit late, but God reminds us that He's in charge, not all of us, in terms of technology. We'll have an opportunity for questions later on. Those of you here in the audience should have already received note cards, and if you can answer those questions, we might have a floating mic, but if you're unable to get to the mic, just raise and somebody will make sure that we batch some of these questions together. So now let's start the conversation. I'm going to turn to these amazing people that I have here, and I'm going to turn to Travis first to ask the question, what's the most effective way to use restorative justice to heal individuals and communities without overlooking the needs of the survivors or victims of crime.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much to my esteemed colleagues here. It's an honor to be with you. I think this is an important question. It is difficult for me as a restorative justice practitioner and the work that we do at Refa Institute to imagine restorative justice as anything other than centering people who've been harmed. That is to say that perhaps, and I say this, I offer this with humility, we just started in the United States practicing restorative justice. Indigenous people around the world have been doing it for hundreds of years. So we're brand new and still really trying to figure this out. But fundamentally, it is about responding to people who have been harmed by violence. Now, the serendipity in this is that typically we find that people who have caused harm have also been harmed. And so naturally, there is a space to engage the person who has caused violence in a moment. But it is difficult to imagine restorative justice in its truest frame without having the person who's caused harm at the center, their needs, and what their pursuit of justice looks like.
Thank you, Travis. Liz, we come to you, and you're looming over all of us, so you look like you're looking down on at least those of us in the panel, but we come to you with the same question. We're so glad you're able to join us even remotely. Again, if you could answer the question, I don't think I need to repeat it, but go ahead.
I think restorative justice principles are extremely important in the context of capital punishment because the stakes are so high. And in that arena, what restorative justice brings, I think, are these opportunities for reconciliation, these opportunities for forgiveness. And I think that, you know, a lot of people, when they consider being victimized in a violent crime, they think, I would want nothing to do with this person ever again. In fact, you know, if it's a particularly, you know, evil, violent crime, people think of, you know, the death penalty and feel like that's a penalty that's owed to victims. But what I think restorative justice approaches have revealed is that, you know, it's actually better for survivors and victims to have these opportunities for forgiveness and reconciliation for their own healing. And I've seen that time and time again in the work I've done. And I think it's, you know, an extremely promising avenue that more victims of violent crime should have available to them.
Oh, thank you. Justice Melton, I come to you. You have probably a different view from many of us, but how do you look at this question? What are the effective ways?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. And let me back up. I've served on a panel similar to this. It was about justice and faith, and the moderator said, I'm going to ask you to define what justice is. And I said, why me? He said, well, it's in your title. So I thought that was fair. And so I started thinking about what is justice, and I realized that people march for it, we die for it, we insist upon it, we demand it, but we don't define it. And I hadn't heard a definition of justice in law school, in Sunday school, third grade civics class, and so I started wrestling with it. And I came up with a long definition. That definition got shorter, not longer, as I played with it, and it basically came down to 3 words, and that is the right response. And I think when we look at justice as the right response and look at social justice as society's right response to criminal activity, that's just one layer. So start with that. Then what Travis was saying, I think, is exactly right. Most of our criminal activity comes out of pockets of toxicity, pockets of unhealed trauma. So then the next question is, how do you provide healing, and where do you provide healing? Restorative justice is a way to provide healing. It's a way to respond to not just that event, but another incident in the step towards adding to the toxicity, the trauma that has just happened. So it's part of the conversation for sure to dealing with all that we're seeing.
Thank you. Sister Liette.
Well, I want to start, I think, with a quote from Parker Palmer, who says that violence happens when no one knows what to do with their pain or their suffering. And having been blessed by working in Chicago with over 100 women who have lost their children either to gun violence or to incarceration, I find again and again when these women come to us, they don't know what to do with their pain and their suffering. And so violence happens sometimes. But the restorative justice, the most effective way I believe to use this philosophy is the tool of a circle. And we at Precious Blood use circles again and again for these healing circles. And to have mothers come together who are suffering from the loss of their children, whether to incarceration or to death by violence. We sit in circle, and so much, I think it's so important because they come into circle and we have talking pieces, and so they each have a chance to have their voice heard. And so when they first come in, we say, "How are you?" And who really asks them sometime, how are they? And especially when they've gone through the trauma of the death of their child, people say, "We don't want to hear that again." But we in circle say, you can tell it again and again. We don't say, "What's the problem?" but what's the story? And so I believe that one of the most effective ways is being able to come together in circle, which is a wonderful tool of the philosophy of restorative justice. And so when mothers, and that's what I have worked with, but it could be fathers, it could be families, it could be community that come together and really dialogue in a safe, sacred space where they can tell their story again and again, where they can wail, because we hear Rama in our scriptures that says, the wailing women cried because their children were no more. And giving mothers, fathers, families, community time to lament, to wail out their pain is so important, I believe. And it's one of the most effective ways of really restoring relationships, restoring the heart, restoring communities. So,
Thank you.
I could tell a story.
No one's going to stop you.
Okay, I'll tell a really story that I won't have all the details, but there were mothers who have lost their children, either daughters or sons, to gun violence. And so in Precious Blood in Chicago, we have probably hired about 5 men who were incarcerated for some 40-some years and were released and now are hired at our at Precious Blood. And so one day, some of the men came to me and said, "Would the mothers that you work with ever be willing to just sit down and talk to us? We so much want to tell how horrible we feel about what we did. We took a life. And we can't talk to the mothers whose sons or daughters we killed. But would your mothers maybe receive our pain?" So Teresa and I talked to a group of mothers and said, "Would you be willing to sit in circle with these men?" And they're like, and so after preparation on both sides, we came together in a circle. And how powerful that was when these men just cried out their pain and told their story to these mothers. And these mothers, as surrogate mothers, received their pain. But it was also helpful for the mothers because they said then, you know, maybe the person who took my child, maybe he feels sorry. Maybe she feels sorry for what she did. And maybe my heart has been opened and expanded because these men told me that they regret so much what they did. And so it's a beautiful circle of reconciliation and forgiveness.
And transformation, right?
Yes. Oh, definitely, transformation.
Travis, I want to come back to you. You're a former police officer, I understand. You founded Rapath Institute in 2017, which I keep telling people 2017 always feels like it was just a few years ago, but it was much longer than that. And you're dedicated to restorative justice and focused on restoration, repair, and healing. So some of what Sister Donna was just talking about, leading people to opportunities and resources to thrive. Help us understand your journey from time serving as a police officer to establishing.
Yeah, it didn't take very long as an inner city police officer in Nashville for me to realize that the legal punishment system was woefully inadequate at solving the problem that we were commissioned to solve. And so, what became readily apparent was that I was not dealing with criminals. I was dealing with survivors. I was dealing with people trying to survive mostly their poverty, trauma, their experiences of pain, however it showed up in their life. And most of those methods of survival are illegal. And as Sister Donna, quoted, yeah, it's people excising their pain through violence. And the theory that emerged for me was, and I mostly working in a community of color, and here I am, a black man, as a police officer, engaging this, and I started to think about my own experience as a black kid growing up in Nashville, and I never went to jail. I never really got in any trouble. And I knew it wasn't because I wasn't bad, because I had it in me. But I realized that I was lucky to be born to the people I was born to, and they gave me the resources that they gave me. That was the only difference. I grew up in North Nashville, and so I began to wonder, and so I thrived because I had what I had. Well, what if everybody had it? And my theory was that if people have what they need to thrive, they will. And our current systems and structures aren't built that way. And it was a matter of luck to be born to the right family to get what you needed to heal and thrive. And so I started Rapha Institute, which is a Hebrew word that means to heal. Rapha, it means to heal. And by his stripes, we are healed. The Hebrew word there is Rapha. It became about how do we help people access resources, communities, and how do we build different systems and structures at the more macro level of communities that help people access resources, basic resources, housing, healthcare, education, economics, and strong social support systems, and believing that if people can do that, that they would thrive. And that landed us into the space of thinking about restorative justice. Can we position it at the intersection of the legal system where people have caused violence? And can we, instead of prosecuting and incarcerating those people, divert those cases to a restorative justice process where the circle is but a small portion of the restorative justice process? The months and months of preparation is all about how do we help build into your life and your experience these resources and access to these resources. And so that's the strategy. We've worked over 250 cases over the last 7 years in our legal system, everything from home burglaries to homicides. And we have a less than 4% recidivism on people who complete our program, over a 90% satisfaction for harmed parties that complete the program. And so, yeah, the thinking through that theory that it's really about resources and less about criminality, and focusing in that space. And we owe that to harmed parties, because every harmed person that we have worked with says one thing: I just never want them to do this again to me or anyone else. And if we then owe it to them to invest in a process that helps a person who has caused harm today, for harmed parties, who has caused harm today, to engage in a different trajectory and have different opportunities.
So Travis, you've talked a lot about resources and a lot about, your parents being the ones who paved a way for you. So how do you think that racial equity or injustice plays a role in restorative justice? How's that carried out in your work?
Yeah. So we think in two frames. There's restorative justice, and restorative justice is about the moment of harm. It's the particular, what we might refer to as, or think about as a crime. It's the bad thing that happened today, the aggravated robbery, the aggravated assault, the homicide. And metaphorically, if we think about that as a weed that has grown in the soil, we then ask ourselves the question, what's wrong with this soil that weed grew? And addressing that ecosystem and that environment we think about as transformative justice. And so restorative justice is the lens that gives us a picture into the vista, the broad spectrum of what are the systems that need to be transformed so that this weed doesn't grow again. And so we pair those pieces together. If and when that happens, and if we can scale that, and if we can all work towards examining these moments of harm, these moments of violence, and interrogating it and allowing it to speak to us about the soil and the system and the structures, and equip ourselves as organizations, as entities, as whether you're a church or a court or a school or a nonprofit, whatever you might, a company. How do we address this ecosystem and make it such that this weed doesn't grow again? It doesn't matter. It won't matter what color you are. You have made justice for everyone. And I believe that that is the call of Christ, for justice to be available for everyone. The need to create equity is an indication that an injustice exists. And if I see an inequity, I need to find the point of injustice and address it. Yes, we can make equitable moves and create equity, but where is the injustice that makes the creation of equity necessary? And how do we work in that space? So moving beyond equality, moving beyond equity, and moving towards justice and centering our work in that space, that's how we approach that. And if that happens, everybody wins, whether you're a poor white person in rural Tennessee or you're a poor black person in urban Nashville, or you are whoever or whatever you are. I think Jesus likes everybody.
I would challenge you to say he loves everybody. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Travis. Liz, I want to come to you. You wrote an amazing Atlantic July cover story about witness, about capital punishment. And you've also argued that those who are unquestionably guilty of heinous crimes should not face execution because of the death penalty's inherent inability to bring about justice. How can this conversation around justice and mercy inform a broader conversation on the way we understand the dignity of human life and the common good?
So I think, when you start thinking about all of the problems with capital punishment, there are all kinds of, procedural issues, I guess you could think of them. That capital punishment is arbitrary, that whether you receive capital punishment depends a great deal on what district you happen to commit your offense in, not necessarily the heinousness of the offense. We know that capital punishment is racist in effect, in that you see more Black people on death row than are reflected in the population in general. It's quite disproportionate, that representation. We know for a fact that juries are more likely to give Black offenders with white victims the death penalty than any other combination of racial factors. And I think all of those points, along with the major innocence issue, that the death penalty, occasionally we know for a fact, people are sentenced to death and have sometimes been executed despite their innocence. And so all of those, I think, are a collection of very serious problems with capital punishment that over the past few decades have been very persuasive to people. But there's also a philosophical element of capital punishment. And that's where we locate the question of, what is the value of a human life? Can the value of a human life be forfeited? The other day, I was watching the memorial for Charlie Kirk, that 5-hour event. And I think the president of, I can't remember, Hillsdale College, said that, the shooter who murdered Charlie Kirk had forfeited his humanity. And I think that is reflected quite often in support for capital punishment. And I think that's really where, among all of the other places, the really major collision happens between Catholic social teaching and the Catholic faith as a whole, and the principles that underlie capital punishment. So I think it's an important arena to really establish the value of human life in every case, because if even a person who has committed homicide, and a particularly violent and aggravated homicide, which is what you receive capital punishment for, that person is still a human being. They're irreplaceable. Their life is still sacred. And what I think is special about arguing that in the domain of capital punishment is that if a person in that situation who's committed an act like that still has an infinitely valuable human life, then everyone does. Everyone does. It includes everyone if we go to that extent. And I think that is, one of the key revelations of Christianity. And I think it's very much worth fighting for in that domain.
Thank you. Liz, you've also shared very publicly in your writing that murder tore into your own family. And as a part of the inspiration for your in-depth writing and on the death penalty, what have you learned but walking closely with individuals on death row that you wish everyone knew, and how has it shaped your sense of mercy?
Yes, my sister-in-law was murdered in 2016. My husband and I grew up in the same town, went to the same high school. His sister Heather went to the same high school as we did. We're all from Arlington, Texas. In 2016, Heather was stabbed to death in her trailer by a former boyfriend who had become very jealous and while very intoxicated. And I remember my husband receiving the phone call from his father that his sister had been murdered, and he was just numb. He was almost vacant with that news. And I expected that his family, because this was Texas, because we all come, from that background, that his family would be very in favor of capital punishment. Now, come to find out, this murder was not classed as first-degree murder, so it wouldn't have been eligible for capital punishment. But there's a bit of time between the point where someone is murdered and the point where the charges are actually handed down and the person is, arraigned. And so, there was a minute where we didn't know if that was going to be an option. My family during that period, as part of their condolences, had said, we hope the guy gets the death penalty. We hope he fries. And that was, in their way, being comforting and demonstrating how much they cared about my sister-in-law. But my husband's family just took a different approach. My husband's family, my husband and his dad, wound up feeling like capital punishment wouldn't fix anything, it wouldn't help anything, and that it would just drag out the process sort of infinitely for decades. And so they were prepared to argue before the prosecutors that they should not seek death. And that surprised me a great deal. I was taken aback by that. And when I started doing my capital punishment work a few years later, that was always in the back of my mind, that victims' families contain within them this huge capacity for forgiveness, and it can be the difference between life and death if prosecutors take those concerns from victims' families seriously. Since I've been involved in capital punishment work, I have come across many instances of victims' families choosing to forgive their family members' killers. There was a case that totally shocked me out of Alabama, a man named Jimmy Barber, who had murdered his girlfriend's grandmother, who was a dear woman and very beloved by a very big family. Jimmy murdered her with a hammer. He was extremely intoxicated. And once he was arrested, put in jail, he decided to turn his life around. He said he was going to be a better person when he left prison, whether it was on his own 2 feet or in a body bag. And he devoted himself to taking correspondence courses on the Bible, became an extremely religious, very faithful man. And, lo and behold, one day, the granddaughter of his victim sent him a letter and said, I can't carry this pain inside me anymore. I can't carry this rage and hurt. I forgive you. And, she sent that letter and she felt somewhat better about it. But what really changed everything is when she got a letter back from Jimmy. And he wrote that he was extremely humbled and completely stunned by her forgiveness, and that it had sort of turned his world upside down and, set him on fire with a fervor for God again. And I think that's really remarkable. And Sarah, the granddaughter, said at that moment, a weight lifted off her. That was the moment where really everything changed and her healing began, is at that point of connection with Jimmy as a human being. And at the time of Jimmy's execution, Sarah had come to completely oppose his execution. And her mother and her aunt were pretty persuaded that the execution should not go forward. Now, prosecutors don't always listen to victims' families when they're in that situation, but I think it's important to recognize it happens far more often than one would think, and that it really points toward possible justice that's based on bringing those kinds of encounters about.
Right. I think it's a real sense of reconciliation. Thank you for sharing that story, Liz. Justice Melton, you've had 16 years of service as the Chief Supreme Court Justice for the state of Georgia. You've seen a wide range of crime and cases come across your desk. What leads you to be someone who's open to restorative justice? And what do you think are the limits to the criminal justice system?
So the limits of the criminal justice system, let's start by defining what the criminal justice system is. Because people talk about, I ask people, grade the criminal justice system, and I'll get grades anywhere from B, few people say A, some people say D's or F's. Then I'll say, okay, what are the elements that cause you to grade your criminal justice system the way you graded it? And they'll talk about racial disparity, economic disparity, outcomes, and things along those lines. And then I'll ask them, what are the factors that feed into that? And they'll tell me all kinds of factors, but very few of those factors actually relate to the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system, I would define as starting when you pick up the phone and dial 911, hey, get over here, something is going down, to the point where somebody exits probation or parole. They've gone through the correction system, if that's part of it. And then when you say, okay, how do we fix those numbers? What people will often talk about are things that don't have anything to do with what happens between 911 and leaving probation or parole. They'll talk about what happens in schools, what happened in neighborhoods, what happened at home, that feed those numbers. Those are the things that also feed the disparities oftentimes. And so one of the things, so if you look at your numbers, your statistics about infant mortality, teenage pregnancy, illiteracy, domestic violence, and you put pins on the map for every time you see an instance, what you'll see, those pins will start congregating in certain pockets. That's what I call the pockets of toxicity. Certain neighborhoods where police get called all the time, these dense neighborhoods. They could be black neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods, they could be white, they could be urban, they could be in the mountains, they could be all over. And so if that's what's happening, then I go to, okay, what is justice? What is our response? And oftentimes there's no response to those neighborhoods. There's no pouring into those neighborhoods. And no response is injustice. We know that. And so when what we know happens in those neighborhoods happens, and then it escalates to the point where there's criminal activity, and now it's in the court system. Now they're looking to the judges to say, hey, fix this. And we're like, we're limited. We got prisons, and we got prisons. And now we've got, ideally, thankfully, we have options such as criminal justice reform and accountability courts to deal with alcoholism, mental health. But we're waiting to the end of the life of an individual to start fixing this stuff while we weren't involved in their neighborhoods. And so one of the things I tell people, you're not high and mighty because you can point to the criminal justice system and demand things while you sit on your couch. It's not great that you can define all these things that everybody else ought to be doing if I don't see you in the neighborhoods, right? Or at least support the people who have the gift and the skill set and the calling to be in the neighborhoods. So the criminal justice system is not going to fix lifelong problems that have been marinating for years without the assistance of the community. It's just not going to happen. And we need to say that out loud, and then we got to get involved in the communities to make that happen and change that ecosystem that Travis was talking about.
So, Justice Melson, you talked about neighborhoods. You have also served for many years with Young Life,
Right.
Christian ministry that reaches out to adolescents, right?
Right.
Across the United States, and there are even children or adolescents that are reached out to around the world. What have you learned about justice and mercy in those years of service?
And that's where I see a lot of the perspective that I have is from my time on the court, but also spending time in these neighborhoods. So I was involved in inner city ministry, even though I don't look and sound like it. I was involved in Techwood Homes, which was the first housing project in the nation. Got to be very comfortable walking around, knowing the kids, and seeing the kids that ended up in trouble. And the myth is, that one of the myths is kids who aren't in the criminal justice system are okay. They are not okay. Right. They just happen not to get caught, but they're in trouble too. And so I saw and see the pathway towards criminal activity, and a lot of times it doesn't match the dialogue that I hear amongst our leaders that talk about criminal justice reform. So I get numb. You could debate whether the industrial prison complex should be there or should not be there, or even what it is. But when I'm walking in the neighborhoods and I see what the kids are doing, and when I go into court and I see the calendar call for what happened and what took place that led people to be in the court and they're taking pleas for this and that, the industrial prison complex doesn't have anything to do with it. It's all this chaos and bad living and need for help and cry out for help that pours into those factors. And it's the same factors that pour into our test scores. All these things are, and the good thing is, when you solve for those problems, you solve for a whole menu of problems at the same time.
Right.
So that's the beauty of it. You solve for the teenage pregnancy, you solve for the alcoholism, you solve for the test scores, you solve for a lot of factors, because now we're living life, and we're living life abundantly.
Right, right. Thank you, Justice Melton. Sister Nana, I come to you now. Now, you've told us a little about your time with Precious Blood Ministries in the South Side of Chicago, and you worked with families that have been devastated by violence, by poverty, by education, some of the things that have already been mentioned by Justice Melton and also by Travis. You've also talked about the mothers you spent time with. You've already shared a story, but what was the most important lesson you learned from these mothers that you can share with us here today?
I learned many lessons from them, but I have to think of the most important. I think probably the most important thing is the mothers, I felt, just want to have a voice. They want somebody to hear them, in their pain. I think also the need for community. They feel so isolated sometimes, especially the mothers, well, all the mothers, but the mothers especially who lost children to incarceration. They carry some sense of guilt. They see some shame, some confusion, and they just need a place where they can tell their story, where they're still respected, where they're heard, and they have community. We have the privilege in Chicago of going to Sawyer, Michigan during the winter months, because we have a good friend who has a wonderful place up in Sawyer, and during the summer he's, a lot of people purchase that for vacation. But during the winter, he allows us to use it. And it's a beautiful place. And we take the mothers up there for a weekend, get them out of the area of the community that there's so much violence and confusion and chaos. And they just spend a weekend up there. but you should hear the stories that come out. It's not about their problems, it's their stories after story after story. And some are hurting because their children are incarcerated. Some are hurting because their children are lost now or never be at the table again. And then it goes all back to so much trauma. They started talking about their own sexual abuse as children. And it went on and on and on about the traumas, repeated generational trauma. But how important it is to have a community where women can come together and share their stories, where they can be heard, where they can be seen, where they can have a sense of belonging, and that their stories are important. And today it was so beautiful. Before lunch, two couples came together in one of the breakout sessions, I guess, and told their story of journey, of forgiveness and reconciliation and understanding of each other. And that dialogue, that forgiveness, that lifting and throwing off those burdens that people carry so hard with all the trauma that they had in life. They're angry, they're sad, and like we were talking before, that anger is just, it's not really that they're angry, but they're sad, they're hurting, they're fearful, and it comes out sometime in anger, it comes out in violence. And so I think one of the most important things that I've learned about all these beautiful women that I've been able to walk with is that they just want to be heard, they want to be loved, they want to be told that they're good. And also I think what I've learned is that how much they need self-care. They need to be helped physically. You know, a lot of them are sick because they carry so much trauma. And sometimes when they let go of all that pain, it's amazing how physically well they are, you know? And so they need spiritual awakening. And through all their journey of letting go and telling their stories and loving each other and feeling heard and feeling that they're seen, it's amazing how they find God in all that. They're transformed, and they find their purpose and how they help each other. One mother comes in who just lost her son, weeping and wailing, and the other mothers just gather around her and say, not much, but just hold her and let her know that we've been there. We'll get through this together. But all of a sudden, there's a connection. And they need to be feeling that they're connected. They're isolated. They're afraid to tell their story. They feel some shame. They feel so much hurt. They've had so much chaos in their lives. And I also, besides the mothers, I also like to go back to the children, because when someone has lost their brother or their sister, you know, who deals with these children? You know, I feel guilt sometimes, or I don't know guilt, but I feel like I want to do more. But, you know, I see all these young men and women, and they don't have a sacred, safe place to tell their trauma, to tell their story. And sometimes that's why violence happens, because they don't know what to do with that suffering and that pain. And they don't always have a container or a place to belong where they can really also. That's why it's important to go into the homes, into the families, and start having circles where also the siblings could say, you know, I hurt too. Will somebody hear me? And so I've learned that also the mothers say, help my children. You know, I don't want to cry in front of them, but I see they're also hurting. So I hear the cry of the mothers to say, help us, help me, help our community that's suffering so much because of the chaos and the traumas, repeated generational trauma that has happened to us in our lives.
Thank you, Sister Donna. I think you've maybe addressed this question, but I'm still going to ask it. But how do you think your ministry helps restore communities? I mean, you've talked about these families that not only have people lost children, but also that piece about individuals losing siblings. I think that often doesn't get counted up enough. But how does your ministry restore them, especially when many people say, oh, they're beyond repair?
Mm-hmm. Well, no one's beyond repair.
Exactly. I said they said.
No, yeah, I know. And you know, sometimes Chicago's called a hellhole, and you know, so all the names we get. But anyhow, so many beautiful people in that city. But I don't even know if this connects. But I'm old, so I don't know if everything connects. But but I think what. I want to tell a story because I think stories are so important. But I remember that I had a group of mothers who had lost their children to incarceration, because I had been visiting the juvenile detention center in Chicago, and the mothers would keep telling me, go talk to or the boys, would say, go talk to my mother. My mother's hurting. I'm worried about my mother. I wish I'd listened to my mother, And so I started gathering mothers who had lost children to incarceration. And so we had circles of that. And all of a sudden, a mother comes screaming out her pain. Her son had just been murdered. Now, I'd just been in Chicago the second year, and I hadn't had a mother who had lost a child to gun violence yet in our stories. So this mother, I invited her to the circle, but I kind of thought she would feel uncomfortable. But she said, well, I just need to be somewhere to tell my pain. And so she came, and the first circle wasn't real comfortable, but she came back. The next circle, as the circle was going around, she told about her pain of her son had been murdered and that he would no longer be at the table. And so the circle went around and everybody was telling their story. Then it came to another woman whose son had been incarcerated for 20-some years as a juvenile. He had taken a life, a double homicide, so he was sentenced to life without parole at that time. The law did change, and he is now released. But anyhow, she was saying that, she said she didn't want to compare, but she just said, this is my story. I go to prison week after week, 4 hours away, visit, he can't come home, he will never be at our table. And so as she's telling her story, all of a sudden, these two women just crossed the circle and embraced and said, we've all lost. We've all lost. And so I think that's how the more people can say, we've all lost, we're all in pain, and especially in the world today, there's so much division. And so when we can dialogue and say, this is my story, how can we be one? How can we come together? So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think that that's how we build communities. The more we dialogue, share our stories, love one another, try to unite. And these problems are everywhere, whether we go in the schools, our churches, our families, South Side Chicago, any of your cities, it's everywhere. I just retired and I moved to Dayton, Ohio from Chicago. I find the same things, maybe on a smaller base, and all of a sudden I'm not retired anymore. Anyhow, thank you.
No, that's an example of restoration. I know that we started a little late because of technology, but I want to give the audience here an opportunity to ask questions. I know some of you received cards at the beginning, and I see people standing up to collect cards, and I think maybe what we'll try to do is batch them because of our timing and see if we can get a couple of questions together for the panel. And while you're collecting questions, there's one question I want to go back to. I quoted Pope Francis in the beginning, and another quote from Pope Francis is, our societies are called to advance towards a model of justice based on dialogue, on encounter, which I think is a lot of what we've all talked about, so that whenever possible, the bonds damaged by the crime may be restored and the damage repaired. How does restorative justice support a model of dialogue and encounter? And I think the circles do that, but I don't know if there are any other examples that we may have not lifted up.
Yeah, I think we talk about accountability and I'm going to hold you accountable, and we fundamentally reject the notion that one can hold another accountable of anything. That accountability is just that, it's an ability. It's an ability to account for something. And most of us aren't born with it. Think about cookies, and it wasn't me. We are born to not account for harm when we cause it. We typically have to learn it. Restorative justice is a vehicle for learning that. And why is this important, and how is this antithetical to the legal system process, the legal punishment system process? And why is dialogue important? You have the right to remain silent. Everything about the legal punishment system says don't tell the truth. Restorative justice is an invitation to tell the truth in safety, without the threat of more harm. It is impossible for me to account for that which I do not know. The only way for me to truly know the extent to which I harmed you is for you to tell me, because you are the only one who really knows what happened. And so creating spaces where dialogue can happen opens the door for me to learn the ability to account for harm when I cause it. And if I can come in and say, yeah, here's what I did, okay, well, now let me tell you what you did when you did what you did. Now I can begin to account, and you now have a pathway for justice, and all of that happens on the superhighway of relational dialogue.
Anybody else before we turn to the audience?
We have several questions here from the audience. I can read them all out, or we want to go one by one?
Maybe do two, and let's then we can see how many we can get in before our time.
All right. There seems to be so much need. How do we expand restorative justice to respond to wider and wider circles? And how do you imagine the role of restorative justice in attending to harms done by or in Catholic churches or in faith communities, generally speaking? Super easy ones.
Easy ones. And I know some people feel like they're off the hook because they don't have to answer the one about the Catholic Church, right? Does anybody, sister?
Well,
I'm not putting you on the hot seat. Yes, you are.
It's in your title.
oh, you can just call me Donna. Well, how to address harm in the Catholic Church, or in our churches. I still think, I always believe in circles. I think it's a wonderful tool. So I think when we can begin to bring together, although it takes a lot of preparation first, and this is the Jubilee year, time to open up the doors, and a whole spiritual renewal. And so if we could bring where there's been harm, after much preparation of both sides, if we could bring them together and really sit down in circle in a safe, sacred space where people feel like they could really honestly, sacredly, safely tell their truth. And to me, that's the only way I know, is to bring people who have been harmed and those who have harmed together in a circle, a beautiful tool that the indigenous people have taught us of a way to bring peace and reconciliation. So maybe people have other ways. That's the way I would have to do it.
Liz, I'm not forgetting you. I just want to make sure if you want to say anything that you're welcome to speak.
I do want to.
Sure, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah. So when we talk about sexual violence and intimate partner violence and domestic violence and the intersection of restorative justice, that there is it becomes, I think, even more important to be guided by the voice of those who've been harmed to determine what the next steps should be. I have not been harmed by the Catholic Church, and so I shouldn't be asked what the next step is. This should be a panel of people who have been harmed by the Catholic Church. They should be asked, how do we do this? They are the light. They are the guide. They know what they need in response. That may be sitting down with someone and talking about whatever. It may be something else. That too is restorative justice, the framing of restorative justice that demands that the person who's been harmed has to sit down with the person who has caused them harm is no different from the legal system. We're telling you what to do. But let's be guided by people who've been harmed. They have the most information as to what should happen next.
And often in the realm of Catholic social teaching, we talk about subsidiarity. We talk about those closest to the problem should be the ones helping us figure out what the solutions are. And that would, again, sound like one example. Maybe you are Catholic, Travis.
I would be a bad Catholic.
I'm not saying I'm a good one, but I am. I'm practicing Catholic.
I barely made it through Mass last night.
The other question, are there other questions, or do we want to get to there was also the question about widening restorative practices. I didn't know if anybody wanted to attempt to answer that one or leave anybody out. Okay, we're moving on.
Well,
Travis
I mean,
always wants to say
Well, I
something.
mean, we can't just leave the people's question unanswered.
Well, I'm looking for those to take it.
Yeah, so we can no longer pretend that we don't know what to do. We do. We know what to do. We have solutions. We have answers. We have a public relations problem with restorative justice at this point. That's our challenge. And I think until it becomes, we had this conversation earlier, I think until it becomes a part of the artistic narrative in our country, those are the wings on which movements happen. When it gets into our music, when it gets on our TV, in our TV shows, in our movies, when we start seeing visual and literary art where restorative justice processes and stories get centered, then it will become more ubiquitous in our society. And so we have folks like Marshall Goldberg and Oprah and others who are beginning to center, and Common, the rapper, who are beginning to center these stories. We have a case that's featured on HBO Max right now, Justice USA, if you happen to have a chance to watch it. We're in episode 6, homicide case. That is when we will begin to get more momentum around this. And if we can change the whole district attorney process in our country, that would be another one.
And I dare say also just being engaged and involved in our communities. I know there's some other.
Let me add to
Sure,
that.
sure, go ahead.
I do think it's important. I'm not a restorative justice expert. I know people who are, but also know the people that you're trying to, the policymakers that you have to convince that this is the way to go. I think you've got to have data. You've got to have statistics about the types of offenses that are being sent to the program, the recidivism rates by comparison. You've got to have data. And the more that data is built up, not just locally, but nationally, the better. Because everybody's got anecdotes on both sides. As soon as something goes bad, that's an anecdote that's going to unravel your anecdote about great things that happen. You're going to have statistics on top of everything else.
Thank you.
On a more local level, we have conversations in communion. That is our way to promote restorative justice and widen that circle. Go see the CNN table.
I do want to name that if incarceration made us safe, we'd be the safest nation in human history. And that with great respect to the Chief Justice, we have plenty of data on what doesn't work, and somehow we keep doing it. So I just want to say that.
Sure. I think we have a couple more questions. I think these will be our last two as well.
You've already gone towards answering some of these in some ways. So why is it so hard for those who favor retribution, even the death penalty, to see the value of restoration? And do you think a day will ever come when we look back at today's iteration of the criminal justice system like we may look back on pre-modern medical treatments?
Sure. So, Liz, I'm going to just come to you because I know it's hard for you to jump in when you're on the screen as opposed to in the room.
So I think it's a great question. And, my experience with people who have been, whose family members have been murdered, who are in favor of capital punishment, is that, sort of like Sister was saying earlier, they don't know what to do with their pain. They are angry. I think anger is a very natural response to a crime like that. And there's sort of no other way for them to channel their anger than to express it in the maximum penalty that's available. And I understand that. I understand how people feel that way. And I think it's important to understand that and not to dismiss it out of hand. I do think there are ways that people can come to channel those really difficult, painful feelings into sort of restorative processes. And I do believe those encounters between victims' families and killers can be, extremely productive for both sides. And so, getting people to part with what they feel are and what are completely justified feelings of anger and pain is sort of the challenge of promoting restorative practices where capital punishment is concerned.
Thank you, Liz. I know we started a little late, we're kind of at time, so I want to ask each one of everyone here with me just kind of one final question. And Travis, I get to go back to you first, but what is one thing that each one of us can do, those here in the room, those watching online, those who will watch a week from now, to do to bring the spirit of mercy to our justice system?
Continue to believe in the human dignity of all people, regardless of what has happened, and let love be the most powerful thing in the universe.
Thank you. Liz.
I think a daily practice of mercy and forgiveness, as difficult and grueling as that can be, is a great preparation and a good spiritual discipline to be in case a person does come in contact with the criminal justice system in some form or another, whether it involves perpetrating a crime, witnessing a crime, being the victim, or a victim's family member. I think just having those strong spiritual capacities that can only be built up through practice and experience is very important.
Justice Malden.
If justice is the right response, and if no response is an injustice, then I would say the one thing you could do is respond. Respond by getting involved with people who are products of these toxic environments, who are in those toxic environments. If unhealed trauma is the problem, then help bring about healing. One person at a time, life on life, with an individual. There are kids, as Sister Donna identified, who have self-identified, who are kids of victims, kids of incarcerated parents. We have kids in schools who are depending on schools for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and sometimes laundry. Their only problem in life is not breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They are not otherwise okay. Fast forward, without intervention, without response, we know they're going to end up, in all likelihood, on somebody's statistical chart. So we have to respond.
That's good.
Donna.
I think that one of the questions that was asked about why people don't really believe in restorative justice or whatever, I think it's because you've not met a person, who really has walked that path or needs that path. So I think that relentless engagement with persons maybe a little bit different than ourselves, to walk with them and to accompany them in their journey, because it's about relationship.
Well, I want to thank all of you in this room. I want to thank all of us, the people that are online joining the conversation. I hope they stuck with us even after the short delay. Just a reminder that this dialogue is being recorded and will be posted both in the Catholic Mobilizing Network website and the Initiative's website. I want to thank my colleagues and friends at CMN, Chris Ann and Lucy and Caitlin, there she is, and all the others to make this happen. This is an amazing collaboration. I'm glad we did this, and this is such a great invitation to partner on this important dialogue. And all my teammates at the Catholic Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. I know some of them are watching as I'm getting messages on my phone. But for all of us here in the room and those who are watching, finally, please join me in thanking Liz Brunig, Travis Claybrooks, Sister Donna Liette, and Justice Harold Melton for being a part of this dialogue on when justice is pursued.